It's good to see you out, and good to see so many visiting with us. I think I haven't gotten around to all the visitors. We've got so many today, and so I haven't met all of them. Met some that know we have some mutual friends, and so that's wonderful. And met some others that that I know through some people at church here that too. But so I was gonna preach about in-laws today, since Olivia's wedding shower is today. But I decided, I guess, we'll leave that for a time when some of her future in-laws aren't here, so we can talk bad about them when they're not here. No. It is good to see everyone. Hope all of you can enjoy that today. And glad they didn't invite us men, but that's just me. So, as we think about bearing one another's burdens, I want us to consider Galatians chapter 6 and verses 1 through 5. I think it says 1 through 4 on the screen there. Should be a 5 up there. But Galatians 6:1, Paul says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." I want us to really pay attention to the connection between those two verses there. It says, "For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load." So I want us to notice a couple of things here. Just real quickly. First of all, in verse 2, he says, "Bear one another's burdens." Verse 5, he says, "Each one will have to bear his own load." Some translations actually translate both of those as burden. And I like the fact that this translation that I've read here actually translates them differently, because they are different Greek words there. The first word refers to a burden that is too heavy for one person to carry. It's too much. You ever had a load like that? You ever had something that was too much for one person to carry? You needed help. You couldn't do it alone. The second word in verse 5, when it talks here about just bearing his own load, this word is one that just describes a basic pack, a soldier's pack that he's required to carry, basically. This is just the regular person's share of a load. And we're expected to carry that ourselves. And so sometimes people think, wait, it says, you're supposed to bear each other's burdens, but then it says everybody's supposed to carry their own, and how does that work? Well, it works because in the Greek, it's not talking about the same thing. Yeah, you carry your own, but then when you get loaded down with more than you can handle, you need some help. You need somebody else to help you carry some of that extra load. So as we consider this, I want us to think about what happens in this process. Paul indicates here in verses 1 and 2 that there is a connection between being, one translation says, overtaken in a sin. This translation said, caught in a transgression. There's a connection between, now this is not talking about the person who is just rebelliously turned against God. This is talking about someone who just gets caught up in a sinful situation. They weren't really necessarily going out to try to go against God or to break his law, but they just got caught by something. They got trapped. Kind of like we talked about during the Lord's Supper. They got snared and kidnapped by this. Now, of course, James tells us that we're sin when we're drawn away by our own lusts and tempted by that. But still, there are times where people go looking for trouble and trying to just rebel against God, and there are other people that, well, they get caught into things, and yes, it's their own fault. Yeah, yeah, it's their own fault, but a lot of us have been there at one time or another where we were caught in something and we needed help getting out of it. But one of the things that we notice here is that these times when people have these burdens that are too much for them to bear can actually be connected to times when they've been caught up in this sin. That sometimes having too much weight on our shoulders can drive us to despair and drive us to do things that we normally wouldn't and know we shouldn't, but we do it anyway. And what we find is that when we help our brethren, our brothers and sisters in Christ, when we help them carry their burdens, we can actually help keep them from falling away from the faith. We can help keep them from getting so caught up in things that they forget who they are and forget what they should be doing. Think about those in the Blue Ridge area who are now unfaithful, but who at one time were faithful members of the church. What caused that? Now, there are a lot of different reasons, and it's probably different for every single person to some degree. But we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that some of them, at least, had burdens to bear that were so overwhelming that they just gave up? You know, we know Satan doesn't quit when we become Christians. He redoubles his efforts to try to destroy us. And that's why we need each other. That's why we need someone to help us bear those burdens at times, so that we don't become so overwhelmed, so caught up in the burden that we stumble and fall. You ever been carrying something that was so heavy that it made you fall beneath the load? That you just couldn't hold it up, or you dropped it? Well, what if it was on you and you couldn't just drop it? It could crush you. And sometimes our burdens may feel that way. And I know a lot of burdens have been overwhelming to a lot of people during this past year. It's been a really tough year for a lot of people. And they've really been burdened. So we need to think about how we respond to the people who have these burdens. And particularly the ones who, because of their burdens, have fallen into a sinful situation. They've been overtaken in their trespasses. What do we do with them? We ignore them, figure, they'll figure it out. Do we criticize them? Oh, they should know better. They know what the Bible says. They know they shouldn't be doing that. Do we shame them? You should be ashamed of yourself. You ought to be doing this or that or the other thing. Do we talk about them behind their back? Do we gossip about them? Fall into some sin ourselves because of somebody else's sin? Do we shun them? Well, we don't have anything to do with them. They're in sin. They're sinners. Can't be around those folks. Do we judge them? Well, they're lost. Or do we offer to help them with their burden? Help to solve the problem. Help them see a light at the end of the tunnel that's not an oncoming train, so that they can again have hope that they've forgotten about. Maybe they've just thought that they've sinned so badly that Jesus could never forgive them or never accept them back. I've heard people say things like that. Well, God doesn't want me anymore because of what I've become. Or I've done some things, I don't think Jesus could ever forgive me for that. What are we going to do? How are we going to respond? Because the way we respond is either going to help bring them back into a relationship with Christ, or it's going to push them further away from Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that we are to blame for everyone who falls away. there are some people who just are going to fall away. But we need to do everything we can to help keep that from happening. So what does the Bible say about bearing the burdens of others? Let's consider just a few verses. Matthew 23, 1 through 4, Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works that they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their little finger." Now, think about that for a minute. Can you imagine being a person that's getting big, huge burdens together and piling them on somebody's back, and then you won't even help them in the slightest to lift any of them? That's what the Pharisees were doing, and we don't want to be like that. At least we shouldn't want to be like that. I hope we don't want to be like that. Why would we want to be that way? And yet, many times, people are burdened by these things. In Luke 11 and verse 46, Jesus again says directly to the lawyers this time, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." The same condemnation, but this time instead of the scribes and Pharisees, it's directed at the lawyers. They're doing the same thing. And sometimes teachers and preachers can put expectations and bind ideas on a congregation that are so overwhelming and so impossible to live up to, that are not what God taught, but what they came up with in their own mind about how things ought to be, that make it just impossible for people to not feel overwhelmed and to not want to give up. So Jesus had an answer to this. In Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavily burdened." Why were they heavily burdened? Well, they were heavily burdened because the scribes and Pharisees and lawyers had been piling all sorts of rules and regulations on top of God's law to try and burdening the people down with these things. It was making it impossible for them to work. So Jesus said, "You come to me. If you're in that, you come to me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, there are two factors here. One, his burden is lighter because he doesn't pile a bunch of man-made rules and regulations on top of it, of what God has commanded us. But secondly, his burden is light and his yoke is easy because when we're yoked together with Christ, he's doing the heavy lifting. He's doing the pulling. And we're walking along with him, learning and being trained by him. Learn from me, he says. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. So if we're Christians and we're feeling, now I know there are a lot of burdens outside of Christianity that affect our lives, okay? But if our Christianity, if our feeling of our duty to God is overburdening to us, something's wrong. It's not supposed to be that way. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't any rules, that there aren't any things that we have to obey. It doesn't mean we just willy-nilly do whatever we want to do. Not at all. But if we're burdened down by it, that's not the purpose. Jesus came to free us from those overly heavy burdens that are hard to bear. He came to bring us a freedom from that. When we become Christians and start living the Christian life, it should be like a weight is taken off of us, not like extra weight is loaded on. If we're feeling like extra weight's loaded on when we become a Christian or as we live the Christian life, something's wrong. Our hearts should be lighter. Our soul should stand up straighter. Romans 15, verses 1 through 3. Paul says, we have a strong obligation. We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. We need to be helping each other. When we're strong, we need to, instead of looking down on the person who's weak, we need to help and support and lift them up and build them up and help them get stronger, because there may be a time when we're the one that's weak and needs somebody to help us. And if we didn't help those weak people to become stronger, there may not be anybody left to help us. And if there's nobody left to help us, we're going to fall under our load and be crushed by it. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14, Paul again urging the brothers, admonish the idle. See, this is not just, do stuff for everybody. No, remember what Galatians 6:5 says, each one is to carry his own load. We're not just doing everything for everybody else. That's not the idea. We're helping people when they need it. Admonish the idle. If they're just sitting around doing nothing, you get on them and tell them, get up and get busy, get to work, do what you're supposed to do. Encourage the faint-hearted. Help the weak. Be patient with them all. So whether we're admonishing someone who's not doing what they're supposed to do and who can, or whether we're encouraging someone who's just ready to give up, and yet they're strong enough, but they're just spiritually and emotionally drained and ready to quit, or whether we're actually helping somebody who's weak, maybe a new Christian, maybe somebody who just for one reason or another is weak and just needs that encouragement. Whichever one of those three it is, with all of them we need to be patient. We need to give some time to it. So let's consider the types of burdens. Think about these for just a couple of minutes. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are physical burdens. Maybe somebody's moving. Maybe somebody has yard work they need to do. Maybe because of age or illness or any number of other things. There are things that normally they could have done, but now they can't. They're just physical burdens. And those physical burdens can be overwhelming at times. There are emotional burdens. Maybe it's death, the death of a loved one. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's stress. And stress, even good events like a wedding, can still be stressful. Even the good things still cause stress. And that can be overwhelming at times. Maybe it was divorce or separation or any number of things that affect us emotionally. The loss of a job, the start of a new job, all kinds of things that are stressful and emotionally draining. Maybe something like, having a baby. We think of it as a joyous event, but how many of us who have children remember when those babies were born and how exhausted we were for the first, 18 years? But for the first few months especially, especially when they won't sleep through the night, and it's just a constant drain on your emotional energy. Maybe there are financial burdens. Maybe someone's just overwhelmed by debt. Maybe they've had the destruction of their property, a car wreck, a house fire, any number of things, a theft even that has devastated them, the loss of a business. A lot of people have had some financial burdens during this past year for sure. Maybe they got a lot of family needs. Maybe it's a large family. Maybe it's a family where maybe they've taken in an elderly parent or other relatives that they're taking in and helping with, and it's a lot on them. There's a lot of things that can be financial burdens. Maybe they've got a kid going off to college. That's a big one for a lot of folks. Maybe a lot of things. They may have those financial burdens. Maybe it's a spiritual burden. Maybe they're newborn Christians. Maybe there are some spiritual weaknesses, some temptations from some sin they had in their life before they became Christians that they're struggling with getting rid of it. And it's still a burden to them. Maybe it's non-Christian family members or unfaithful family members. A lot of that can be devastating to someone. It can be very much a spiritual burden. Maybe there are social burdens. Maybe they're single in a world of couples. Maybe they're a single parent trying to handle that. I took the 3 little ones to Six Flags. I'm surprised I can stand up here today. Took them yesterday down to Six Flags, and watching 3 kids all day long. Single parenting is hard stuff. I mean, I'm not a single parent, but just for the day, like, what would that be like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? They may need some help. Widows and widowers face some social burdens as well as the emotional burdens. Maybe they're just shy and need a friend. A lot of social burdens, and certainly a lot more than we have mentioned here on all of these. Mental burdens. Maybe they are just ignorant of what the Word says. Maybe they just need to learn more of God's Word. Maybe they have some fears or doubts or misunderstandings that are causing them to be overburdened. And maybe we can help lift some of those burdens by allaying those fears, giving them confidence to replace those doubts, giving them understanding to replace the misunderstanding, and giving them knowledge to replace that ignorance, and can help them lift those loads. We need to think about it. To conclude, what is your attitude toward those who are overburdened? What do you think about? What do you think when you see somebody who especially may have become so overburdened that they fell away, fell into sin and wandered away from the Lord? Do you judge them? Talk about why they should have taken care of themselves and maybe even prevented the burden from ever happening to them? Blame them for the burdens that... And like I said, sometimes it does seem like, well, it is their fault. But regardless of whose fault it is, they need help. They need someone to lift that burden with them and get it off of them so that they can do better in the future. What if Jesus felt the same way toward you and your burden of sin that you feel toward others who are burdened by sin? Where would you be? Would you have been helped or hindered even further? Jesus is always a good guide for us. If he was like we are, would we have been better off or worse off? Well, there's no way we would have been any better off because he was perfect. But he gives us that standard. If Jesus had just talked about how bad we were, we'd still be bad. If he had just condemned us and said, y'all need to do better, figure it out, we'd still be in the same boat. Paul says that we need to be burden bearers and not burden analyzers. He doesn't say, figure out why they're overwhelmed by this burden. He just said, hey, they're overwhelmed by the burden. Help them carry it. A man fell into a pit and couldn't get himself out. A subjective person came along and said, I feel for you down there. An objective person said, it's logical that someone would fall into the pit. A A Pharisee said only bad people fall into pits. A mathematician calculated how he fell in the pit and how far down it was. A news reporter wanted the exclusive story of his pit. Confucius would say, if you would have listened to me, you wouldn't be in that pit. Buddha would say, well, your pit is really only a state of mind. The realist says, yes, that is a pit. Scientist calculates the pressure necessary in pounds per square inch in order to get him out of the pit, but doesn't do anything about it. The geologist told him, you should appreciate all the different rock strata in your pit. The evolutionist said, you're a rejected mutant destined to be removed from the evolutionary cycle. In other words, you're going to die in that pit so that you can't produce any more pit-falling offspring. The county inspector asked him if he had a permit for that pit. Professor gave him a lecture on the elementary principles of the pit. An evasive person came along and avoided the subject of the pit altogether. A self-pitying person said, well, you haven't seen anything until you've seen my pit. Mine's a lot worse than yours. The optimist said, well, things could be worse. The pessimist said, things will get worse. Wait till it rains down there, then you'll be in mud up to your knees. But Jesus, seeing the man, took him by the hand and lifted him out of the pit. Which one of those are we like? Are you a burden bearer or a burden analyzer? Do you have burdens that you need to turn over to Jesus? Or do you have burdens that we can help you with today? We're here to help. We want to help so that you're not overwhelmed by those burdens, so that they don't pull you away from Jesus. If you have a need for God's help or for ours, if you let it be known, we want to help. Let us know as we stand and as we sing.